Hey everyone, Father Lane here. Welcome to another class in our course on the Pentateuch. Today you can see we are in downtown St. Louis, the gateway to the west, facing to the east back towards Illinois. It's appropriate because today we're going to discuss how Israel left Egypt, also crossed a body of water, headed east, this time leading them to freedom. Let's look at our agenda for today. We're first going to look at the entire book of Exodus and see its function within the Pentateuch. And then we're going to zoom in on the figure of Moses, the most important character of this part of the Bible. And then we'll talk about the event that led rise to Pharaoh eventually setting the Israelites free, if only for a couple of chapters. Anyhow, Exodus is a crucial book of the Bible. It details the Old Testament's most important character, the most important event, and indeed the most important moral code of the entire Old Testament. It's going to take us from the death of Joseph, the last patriarch, all the way to the construction of the tabernacle, God's dwelling that remains with his people in the wilderness. You can see here on your screen an overview of the entire Moses sequence. Moses is going to be the main character of the rest of the Pentateuch. Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. You can see that the entire sequence is going to be centered on what happens at Mount Sinai. The Exodus is sort of a prelude to all of this. The revelation at Sinai is going to take up the second half of Exodus, all of Leviticus, and the beginning of Numbers. Today we're going to talk just about the leftmost trapezoid, these first 12 chapters or so of Exodus, where we hear about what happens before Israel leaves Egypt. Exodus has an important legacy within the Old Testament, and I want us, as we usually do when we're reading narrative books of the Old Testament, to keep in mind the past, present, and future. Exodus does narrate Israel's past. It narrates Israel's collective memory of its liberation from foreign slavery, but it's speaking to a present that also knows something about foreign slavery. Keep in mind, subsequent generations of Israelites are going to suffer oppression under the Assyrians, who are going to exact heavy tribute, under the Babylonians, who are going to take them into exile, under the Persians, who will let them return to their land but still keep supervision over them, and the Greeks, eventually, who will persecute them and martyr several. Moreover, Exodus is looking to the future. It's summoning its readers to faith and action, that is, to trust that the Lord is a liberator. The Lord liberates his people, he instructs his people through the Torah, he remains present with his people later in the temple, but here in the tabernacle, and he ultimately is a partner with them in a covenant relationship. You can see this quote from Walter Brueggemann at the bottom of your screen. Israel is a community like none that had yet been, the recipient of God's liberating power, practitioner of God's sovereign law, partner in God's ongoing covenant, and host of God's awesome presence. There's quite a lot there. So let's jump into the story. Pharaoh sees that the Israelite people have multiplied, and look what he says. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them to stop their increase. Otherwise, in time of war, they too may join our enemies to fight against us and so leave the land. Accordingly, they set supervisors over the Israelites to oppress them with forced labor. 2 points here. First, you're going to see this again, where Israel does ally against bigger empires, and that does bring about oppression and eventually the exile. But also here, notice that word forced labor. Here on your screen, you have all of the instances of this Hebrew noun mas, which means forced labor, in the Enneateuch, in the Pentateuch plus the first 4 historical books, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. Notice what's going to happen. There's an ironic reversal. All of this begins because Pharaoh is imposing forced labor on the Israelites. Later, when Israel has a king, Solomon is going to ally himself with Pharaoh, marrying his daughter, and is going to impose forced labor on his own people, and that's what provokes the schism, the divided kingdom between the north and the south, that eventually leads to the unraveling of the nation. So notice what's happening here. God's not so much a fan of his chosen people being put to forced labor, regardless of who's doing it. Of course, the instrument who's going to liberate Israel from forced labor is Moses, so let's talk about him. We learn about his birth in chapter 2. A man of the house of Levi married a Levite woman, and the woman conceived and bore a son. Note, Moses is a Levite. When the child grew, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses, for she said, I drew him out of the water. Of course, Moses will grow up in the Egyptian palace. He's going to eventually kill an Egyptian and has to flee, and he goes to the land of Midian. This is in the wilderness, and he sat down by a well. You know what happens next. This is our type scene. We saw it in Genesis. He's gonna get married, and indeed he does. He marries a foreign woman, and he's tending the flock of his father-in-law, Jethro, the priest of Midian, when the burning bush incident happens. Note where it occurs, the mountain of God, Horeb. Horeb and Sinai are the same place. So this is some foreshadowing. God appears to Moses at Sinai, and he's going to appear to all the people in Exodus 19 also at Sinai. That brings us to the event of the Exodus. Let's see how God gets involved here. We are at the end of chapter 2. The Israelites groaned under their bondage and cried out, and from their bondage their cry for help went up to God. God heard their moaning, and God was mindful of his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God saw the Israelites, and God knew. Note the way that's phrased. God simply knew. Again, God is a liberator. He remembers his covenant. He's a faithful covenant partner with his people, and he eventually liberates them and gives them the law and the land. The land will be a sacred place for the people to receive God's instruction. That's going to be a major theme throughout the Pentateuch, and for that matter in the historical books. Let's take a look here at the different scenes of this subunit. We've already talked about Moses' childhood and early history. That takes place in Egypt. And then chapters 3 and 4 occur on the Sinai Peninsula, where Moses receives his vocation. He's going to come back to Egypt and make a failed initial demand for Pharaoh to release the slaves. But then Exodus is going to be interrupted by a Toledot, by a list of sons. It's only in the middle of chapter 6 that we return to Egypt and we get a consistent narration that leads us ultimately to the liberation of the people. This brings us to the 10 plagues. Moses is going to demand, "Let my people go," and we're told that Pharaoh is obstinate. And one of the common motifs is that God has to show and make it known that he is the Lord. There's a polemic in this section of the Lord fighting against the gods of Egypt, showing himself more powerful. This is a motif we'll see later in the Old Testament and other places as well, where the Lord has to show his power over and against foreign gods, because in the ancient Near Eastern cultures, it was thought that if nation A defeats nation B, it's because nation A's gods are more powerful than nation B's gods. So as we look at the 10 plagues, we notice there are some inconsistencies. There are some challenges in here. You'll notice at the bottom of your screen here, we're left with the question, how are the cattle, whom we're told are killed in the 5th plague, alive to die again in the hailstorms of the 7th plague, only to have their firstborn killed later in the 10th plague? Some of the commentators have pointed that out. Moreover, as we look at the plagues, Psalms 78 and 105, the historical psalms in the Psalter, tell us about the plagues, but there's no awareness of there being 10 of them. In the 10 plagues, there are 3 elements of a plague. God gives a command to Moses, in J directly, in the P texts through Aaron's staff, through Aaron's instrumentality. The plague takes place, and then Pharaoh responds obstinately. We also see Pharaoh's magicians in the P texts. You can see them separated up there on your screen. I've got the numbers which indicate the chronological order in the narrative of the 10 plagues. In any case, all of this leads up to the plague of the firstborn, which is narrated in Exodus chapters 11 and 12. Of course, the Passover meal takes place. The blood is placed on the doorpost to protect the Israelites. Pharaoh is not so fortunate. Pharaoh finds that not only is his firstborn dead, but all of Egypt has experienced the sword in the plague of the firstborn. We pick up in Exodus 12:30. Pharaoh arose in the night, he and all his servants and all the Egyptians, and there was loud wailing throughout Egypt, for there was not a house without its dead. During the night, Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron and said, "Leave my people at once, you and the Israelites. Go and serve the Lord as you said." Notice the light blue on your screen. This is the Hebrew root avad, the root from which we get the verb to serve as a slave. It can also in some contexts mean to worship, to serve in the worshiping sense, that is, I serve the Lord in that I worship him, or I do the work of a slave. What's happening here at this climactic moment is that Pharaoh's slaves become the Lord's slaves. God liberates his people and makes them his own, taking them from the lordship of Pharaoh. This is going to be a central theme throughout both testaments. In our next class, we'll look at what happens next. Until then, read well and pray well.